Oh, welcome everybody. I'm Richard Dennis, Executive Director of the Australia Institute, and what a wonderful room to have such a wonderful conversation in tonight. So I'll be back in a minute to talk to you, but let me first start by welcoming, and what I'd like you all to do is turn your phones off. I organised that seamlessly for the prompt, but I'm just really honoured to introduce Uncle Michael West from the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. He's born and raised and lived his whole life here in Sydney's Aboriginal communities. He's a member of the Stolen Generations. And if you want to know more about him, he'll tell you a bit about his journey tonight. Michael's had a variety of previous roles, including a Director of New South Wales Indigenous Chamber of Commerce, a Director of the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, and Co-Chair of National Sorry Day Committee. So please join me in welcoming Uncle Michael.
How's everyone? Looking forward to this talk, no doubt. I'm looking forward to it too. I was talking to someone from the library as I was driving here and about the subject tonight, what's happening in the United States, what's not happening, one might say. Yes, I mean, it's been about crazy 8 years or whatever, hasn't it, when you think about it. Yes, the pandemic, telling people to inject yourself with bleach, probably not a good idea. And then you see the health officials shocked in the background. And then you have to put warnings out countrywide, please don't inject yourself or drink bleach. It's not a solution. Yes. I was going to say, here where we are is beautiful Gadigal country, and we have the most beautiful harbour in the world, don't we? We're lucky to have that. And what I was going to say, I talk about here where we are is Gadigal. Obviously, Camaragal's the other side of the coat hanger. We have Wongal as we head inland on our left if we're paddling out there. On our right's Wallamadigal, obviously we're riders, and Bennelong being a partner of a strong Camaragal woman named Barangaroo, where we have a piece of land named after her. And we also have where the Opera House named after Bennelong, where he had his place. And then we keep going, we have Parramatta, which is Barra Madigal. In our language, we have the trill. So other languages have that too, the Welsh language. So Barra means eel, and there's a whole beautification story about Sydney Harbour and the waterways being created by a giant Barra, which is now just resting off of East Balmain. There's a little island called Memel or Memel, also known as Goat Island, but its real name is Memel. It's transitioning back to the Land Council on a long journey. What I was going to say too is our totems are very important. We lost a few years ago, billions of them a few years ago, with the fires that we had, those firestorms. And our totems are very important to us. Whales would come in here as part of the totems of the Gadigal. There's also engraving over at the coal loader, a beautiful whale engraving, and they would have different names. The whale would have different names up and down the coast as it's journeying with their little calves. And they would actually come in here to Gomera, which is Darling Harbour, for their rest, but unfortunately they can't. They've got the boat show down there now, and other things. But I was thinking about that the other day. Wouldn't it be great if they come in here and rest? But they can't anymore. But they do come in and visit. I'm sure it's in their memory over many, many millennia coming in here. And I was going to say there's a beautiful bird that has white feathers, black tail feathers. It has a long neck and a long beak. It's called the sacred ibis. Don't call me a bin chicken, thanks. I'm the sacred ibis, just as in Egyptian culture has the sacred ibis. It's very important to remember that. And it actually, I was talking to some of the other elders the other day, and we're having a conversation about this. It actually has a parallel with Aboriginal people when you think about it. Why do you think that is? Because it's been dispossessed of its country. It's a wetlands bird. It's a beautiful bird. It's kept me sane through the pandemic. I could go out and see a little community of them, probably to the wall there, and seeing them, their little babies. And I think because I respect them and that, I've been lucky, privileged to see one of their young ones with a very small beak in my front yard, and the parents looking after it because they are monogamous. And what I was going to say, they may be going through bins and they may look a little bit dirty, but it's not their fault. It's actually on the humans' fault because we haven't cared for their country, and they're just trying to survive. And And as I said, look, they've been dispossessed of their land, we have ours, and they've been blamed for their situation, as so have we. So we need to be intelligent humans and intelligent Australians and make sure that we have a proper road forward in reconciliation, and we can do better. We're a very rich first world country and we have people living in third world conditions, and we can do a lot better. I know there was the referendum last year. It didn't go the way Aboriginal people wanted, but we had 6.5 million people vote for us. There's a lot more education to be done, a lot more truth-telling, I think, and that'll change people's minds and change people's heart. And what I was going to say, it's important we take a moment's silence to pay respects to ancestors, pay respect to Mother Earth, pay respect to those we've lost along the way. They're not just numbers. They're people who have their own dreams, their own families, their own communities, their own names. And then also it's important to pay respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tradition owners, elders and custodians of past and present for looking after country, spirit of country and culture. And as an Australian, you have a responsibility to look after that. We have those 40,000-year-old fish traps in New South Wales at Warorna, and the 40,000-plus-year-old burial sites with Mungo men and Mungo women with ceremony and ochre and that. So if we have a moment's silence, a moment of paying respect, a moment of our reflection journey here right now, and a moment of centering ourselves. We have those three beautiful rivers, don't we, that are boundaries of the Eora Nation. We have the Hawkesbury, Nepean and Georges. On behalf of Metropolitan and Local Aboriginal Land Council, our elders and our members, welcome everyone here tonight. I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting conversation. Yes, what does the future hold? I guess turn the page. Yes. And we'd like to say, look, everyone, let's all work and walk together and have those honest conversations and truth-telling that we need to. And being here, I was actually here for this library, for this auditorium opening, and I've been here many a times, and I think when I come to the State Library here, it was a place where Aboriginal people, I guess, were also not included, and there's some sensitive material here. But what's great about the State Library, I know the last year we opened up a special room for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that could go there and read material in a sensitive and culturally safe way. And that's what we've got to do, be sensible, understand each other's culture, and we want you to also remain strong in your identity and your culture. It's so important. Well, I think we've learnt that the last few years through this pandemic. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land never ceded. Let's all respect each other. Let's respect the animals. Let's respect the ibis, and let's respect if they had a bit more respect, I think, around the world in some of the places where we see and a bit more love in their hearts, I think we'd have a far better world, wouldn't we? Maybe some of the people need a big hug too. I think they do. Enjoy tonight, and I'm sure it's going to be an interesting conversation. I'm sort of a bit scared and looking forward to what the future holds in America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And again, thanks everyone for coming along. It's a really special night for us at the Australian Institute. It's our 30th anniversary this year, 30 years of trying to put big ideas into Australia's national debate. And a night like tonight is just a wonderful way to both do that and to celebrate that. So thank you to everyone for coming along tonight. Thanks to our donors in the room. Look around and look at all the other people that are here listening. Thanks to you. So I really appreciate it. And tonight, and indeed Professor Stiglitz's trip is in part supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation. So thank you very much to Andrew. Look, let me get straight down to business. There's going to be, I reckon, a bit to talk about tonight. Our first guest is, of course, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Joe is former chief economist at the World Bank, Nobel Prize-winning economist, chair of the US Council of Economics Advisors under President Bill Clinton. Joe's Professor of Economics at Columbia University Business School And to say he's had an impact on the economics community, and indeed the economics debate, is just an incredible understatement. So can we start with just welcoming Professor Stiglitz again? Joe was only out here 2 years ago as a guest of the Australian Institute. It's just amazing to have him back again. Our next guest tonight is, of course, Malcolm Turnbull. Malcolm was our 29th Prime Minister, had a career in law and business and the media before going into politics. Obviously, Malcolm's had some interesting engagements with the US over the years, which I suspect might even be discussed tonight, including having negotiated with President Obama a deal to take refugees to the US, one that President Trump, of course, had some views about. And of course, Malcolm also played a role in reviving the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP as it was called, after the United States withdrew, which, if we think about it, given Donald Trump's approach to trade at the moment, there's some history repeating itself there. So can we please join Malcolm Turnbull for speaking tonight? It's really an honour to have you here. Thank you, Malcolm. And then finally, Dr. Emma Shortis leads our International and Security Affairs program at the Australia Institute. Emma's an historian, a writer. She's written a wonderful book about Australia's relationship with America called Our Exceptional Friend, Australia's Fatal Alliance with the United States. And Emma's also just started a new podcast series that we've produced at the Australia Institute called After America. So I guess it depends on the election result what that means. Anyway, Emma will be taking Joe and Malcolm through a conversation tonight. So with no further ado, over to you, Dr. Emma Shortis.
Thank you, Richard. Not much to talk about. I think we'll struggle to fill the time. We here in Australia have, of course, been watching this election cycle in the United States with a growing sense of unease. I think, as Michael said, we're all a little bit scared. Perhaps that has been tempered a little bit in the last week or so with the joy and enthusiasm that seems to have infused the Harris campaign for the nomination. But the fundamental truth of those real and active threats to American democracy and the shared values that underpin our relationship with the United States, those fundamental threats remain, and they are very real. So we're here to think about the state of the alliance, the implications of the election for us and for the world. And I think, if nothing else, it's clear here that Trump unites thinking people all over the world. And I hope there is an opportunity here in that for those new alliances to grow, for new thinking here in Australia about our most important security relationship and our role in the world. But we have to start, of course, in the United States. How could we not? Joe, your new book is called The Road to Freedom. And the election campaign now seems to be increasingly about competing ideas of freedom. That's even been given musical form by the campaigns. So Trump will, at his rallies, often come on stage to a song called God Bless the USA. And the kind of triumphal line in that is, I'd rather be an American because at least I know I'm free. So it's a very kind of negative, individualistic perception of freedom. Harris, on the other hand, has just released her first campaign ad, which has Beyonce's Freedom as the soundtrack, the Beyonce song Freedom, which is a big deal. Beyonce doesn't let many people use her songs. And the line is, I need freedom too. I need freedom too. Now, your book focuses on the relationship between freedom and inequality and our perception of freedom and how that's perhaps informed or not by inequality. So I wanted to begin by asking you how much economic stagnation and inequality in the United States explains the rise and the continued prominence of Trump, and how important you think those competing ideas of freedom in America will be in this election.
Yeah, well, first, it's so wonderful to be here and to be in such a beautiful room and to be with all of you again. I think I wrote the book partly because I thought the issue of freedom would be a big one in the campaign. And my publisher was very helpful in getting the book out in about 5 months, which is very unusual for a publisher, because they were aware, of the campaign and that this issue of freedom would potentially play a role. And you put it well by saying the view of freedom that I articulate in the book is freedom to do something. So somebody who's on a point of starvation really doesn't have any freedom to do anything. He does what he has to do to survive. And that a lot of what I view as the democratic agenda has been to enhance individuals' capacity to do things, to live up to their potential, to have, consider the most important freedom, the freedom to live. If you don't, if we hadn't had the vaccine from COVID-19, many of us might not be here, and our freedom would have been taken away. And that needed government to do the basic research of developing a mRNA platform and bringing the drug to market, and that enhanced our freedom. But having that freedom meant we had to pay taxes to support that. So you took away a little freedom, but overall, as you look at that, taking away a little freedom by saying you have to pay a little bit of taxes is de minimis relative to the freedom to live. And that sort of model is really all over. If you want to think of another example, that I talk about in my book is stoplights, traffic lights, take away your freedom. You can't move until you have a green light. But if you live in a place like New York or London or Sydney, if you didn't have any stoplights, you would have gridlock, and nobody could move. So a little bit of restriction of freedom to say you have to take turns actually gives everybody more freedom than they otherwise would have had. So the notion is in our complicated, integrated society where we interact all together, we have to understand that one person's freedom can be another person's unfreedom, and that we have a collective decision to make in balancing these freedoms. It's not obvious. In some cases, it's not obvious how you balance it, but in the examples I've just given, it's pretty obvious. And so what I think the democratic vision is that we ought to have intelligent debates about this, and some cases will be easy, and other cases we may not fully agree, and those will be continued part of the electoral process. But that the Republican view doesn't make any sense. That, to put it bluntly, even the notion, some of this outside the United States should seem obvious. The freedom to carry a gun means that you wind up with a country where every little kid has to, in kindergarten and first grade, get training what to do if a gunman enters your classroom. And so they lose a basic freedom from fear. And so many of them every day lose their lives because almost daily there's been a mass shooting. So again, you're taking away the freedom to live, which is the most important freedom. So my view is that and I wrote the book because I thought the Republican concept of absolute freedom makes absolutely no sense. And that I'm trying to promote here a broader view of that concept. Now, whether the debate will get elevated to the level where they'll make that kind of discourse. I don't know. I'm not sure. I think it may be in much more, especially with Trump and Vance running, it may be a much more elemental discussion than a discussion of the kind I've just described.
I think so, unfortunately. Malcolm, turning now to Australia in the context of Joe's comments and the rise of Trump and Vance and the very clear threat that they pose to American democratic institutions, which they've reminded us again. Trump has just reminded us in the last 24 hours by telling a group of Christian nationalists to get out and vote. They need to vote this time, and then in 4 years they won't need to again. So he's not hiding the ball, shall we say? No. There has been quite a conversation in Australia about how we might, and our government in particular, might approach a second Trump administration in the context of that threat. And there have been several kind of moments in the recent history of that discussion that have degenerated into quite a kind of farcical discussion. So the one that stands out to me is when Nigel Farage interviewed Donald Trump and, made those comments about Ambassador Kevin Rudd, when Donald Trump clearly didn't know who he was talking about, but made a few comments, and the Australian media exploded about how would this ambassador who's criticised Donald Trump be able to do his job during a second Trump administration. But what was lost in all of that the criticisms Rudd had made were about the threat that Donald Trump posed to American democracy. And there wasn't much that I saw, at least, in the coverage of that, arguing that actually that's what our ambassadors should be doing. They should be standing up for the integrity of American democracy and be proud, particularly of American democratic values. So in that context and the discussion that we are having about the alliance now here in Australia, what do you think Australia's interests are in the alliance?
Well, I mean, the United States is our major ally in a military defence context, but also our ties to the United States, our connections are, so numerous. They're complex. It's families, it's cultural, it's business, it's historical. There are so many. But here's the thing, just pivoting to the politics of it. There is a tendency in Australian politics to want to outdo each other in sucking up to the Americans. and I have to say it's by and large bipartisan. I won't go through all the cringeworthy examples, but there's some people like Laurie there who've known me for a long time. I've never been very good at sucking up to people, I have to say, and I don't think I'll develop an interest in it in my old age. But I think people forget, Australians forget, that in the imperial capital they regard deference as their due. So if you go to Washington, or indeed to Beijing, or in the old days to London, and you grovel and carry on and suck up, they just say, "Oh, that's great. Is it time for the next sycophant? Surely he's had his 10 minutes of sucking up." It is crazy. You win no respect at all. And of course, with Trump, who is like the ultimate narcissistic, blustering bully, it is the worst possible thing to do. Now, I was very lucky with Trump in this sense that my first engagement with him, or enragement with him, to use a fabulous Joe Stiglitz word that he often uses about Fox News, was over this, everyone here knows about it, was, over a deal I'd done with Obama that Trump wanted to renege on. Anyway, and we had a huge, blazing row where I basically said, "You've got to stick to your word." And Trump said, "Come on, Malcolm, you're a businessman. You must have reneged on deals." I said, "No. No, he did. He did. That's exactly what he said." Said, "No." I said, "Ask your friends. We've got friends in common. my reputation is being a man of my word. I've got lots of other bad things people say about me, but people generally haven't said that I'm untrustworthy in that regard. So I've made this point to Trump anyway, and so the conversation began, "No way, Jose," and ended up, "Yes, I hate you. Yes, but I hate you," basically. I mean, he did. He said the call was worse than the one he had with Putin. Although, as I later learnt when I saw them together, he really loves Putin. So it's a bit complex. But the point is, by standing up to Trump and not, doing what they were, American side were back channeling us to not raise the issue, I won his respect, and I was able to get some very good outcomes for Australia. And so, you read all this stuff, particularly in the Murdoch press, about how you've got to have an ambassador that sucks up to Trump and you've got to flatter him. That is all bullshit, believe me. I mean, I promise you, there are a lot of leaders at the time Trump came in who did exactly that, and they got nothing. The only way to deal with bullies is to stand up to them. And the thing that an Australian Prime Minister knows when they go into a room with an American president is that they're the one person in the White House the president can't fire. So all his staff, they've got to be careful, because the boss can go, "Oh, I'm sick of you telling me what I don't want to hear, you're out." Okay, and that's what Trump does. But if you're the Prime Minister of Australia, the only people that can sack you are your colleagues back home, which, of course, I'm very familiar. I'm very familiar with the process. But so it's really important. It's really important for Australia to engage, from a position of strength. I mean, there is a complexity there. I'll just conclude on this point, that Albanese has to recognise, and I had to too, that the sort of right-wing media ecosystem here, mostly News Corp, but not entirely, is basically, Trump is now the central sort of avatar of that universe. And so if disagreement between an Australian Prime Minister and Donald Trump, they will side with Trump.
Yeah.
So, but that is no reason to do anything other than be absolutely strong, play a straight bat, and of course, needless to say, the last thing. Trump got really bad press when he had this tantrum with me. It really did not help him, and I think he was very conscious of that. As far as our ambassador, the Australian government appoints the Australian ambassador to Washington, and just like the American government appoints the American ambassador to Canberra, and the idea that you'd be taking direction from the White House as to who our ambassador should be. I mean, declaring an ambassador persona non grata is a big deal. That's the kind of thing you do to the Russians when they're spying on you or something. So that isn't going to happen. So, Albo, whatever people think of Kevin, and, I've had an up and down relationship with him. We're currently in love again, but it's been patchy, I'd have to say. But the Albanese should stick with Rudd, and and he'll and just be very strong and play a straight bat. That's what he's got to do.
We'll come back to much of that, I think. Joe, I think it's fairly safe to say that a hypothetical second Trump administration would be quite different from the first, given what we know of the plans, behind his campaign. Given that, and given the polling, given it's still certainly possible that Trump could win, how do you think Americans should be preserving and strengthening their own democratic institutions? And do countries like Australia have a role to play in that?
Yeah, so we're all praying, and I am very hopeful by what's happened in the last week, and she's Kamala is clearly a good campaigner. So, but I think your question is really on spot. It's very clear that there's a fragility to our democracy, and I think there are several aspects of what has been happening that are institutional, and then there are some that are related to policy. So institutionally, I think, when we were kids, we were taught that our founders 200 and some years ago in 1789 got a message from heaven and figured out how to design the optimal democratic system. And we now know that they didn't quite get it all right. And, it was a step forward from where they had been, and not that much. There have been some thinking about how you create democratic institutions, but they hadn't got it quite right. And I think Australia has done a number of things that I think are better in terms of democratic institutions. One of them is mandatory voting. I think that's. The second one is what we call rank order voting. You have another name called preferential voting. And if the U.S. had had rank order voting, Trump would not have been on the ballot in the first election in 2016. It's that failure that led him to be a candidate, and a lot of the outcomes that we've had that are so perverse in so many districts of the extreme right would not have existed, and it would have changed the party dynamics inside the United States. So rank order voting is a second important thing. Third, I think that first past the post institutions, especially in the context of a country where you can have change the districts in ways that you can. 25% can get 50% of the votes, 50% of the seats in the Parliament and Congress. So gerrymandering is really rampant, and another flaw we have, not to list all the flaws, the Supreme Court in the United States has some obvious problems, but one example in this context, it said that gerrymandering was not necessarily a bad thing, and it delegated the responsibility for overseeing whether it was to the states where there's gerrymandering. So it said gerrymandered states should decide whether gerrymandering is a bad thing. Well, it was such an absurd decision that really, called into question the logic of the Supreme Court. So, I think those are all examples of, we were talking before that gerrymandering doesn't, how you allocate, you can design institutions that are rise above politics in designing the districts. And it's not something that can't be solved, and you've solved it. So to me, that done a lot better than we have. So I guess what I'm saying is that all those are examples of things on democratic process, democratic institutions where I think that we have something to learn from Australia. On the policy side, I think and this relates to your first question that I didn't fully answer. I think the fact that we've allowed inequality to grow to the extent that it has provided a fertile field for populism, and particularly for the authoritarian version of populism, it wasn't inevitable, but it created a fertile field, and we were just very unlucky to have Donald Trump arise at that moment. And I don't think it was inevitable, but maybe there was a high likelihood that somebody like him would arise and present the kinds of problems that we now have.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose to just continue that, Malcolm, of course, you mentioned Fox News, and we've talked about misinformation a little bit. And by far, I think the most important and influential person in Australia's relationship with the United States is, of course, Rupert Murdoch. There have been stories in there's a story in the New York Times this week about his manoeuvring to keep his empire, his media empire, and Fox News in particular, as that conservative bastion after he dies. And that story, which I highly recommend you read, buried the lead a little bit in that it had a line in there about how former Trump Attorney General Bill Barr is the one leading that charge to keep that empire conservative. Would you speak a little bit, I think, about the danger of that Murdoch empire to democracy and the critical role that media as an institution should play in democracies?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's anyone alive that has done, any individual person alive who's done more damage to the United States than Rupert Murdoch. I think I think he's done more damage to the United States than he has to Australia, frankly, partly because of the reasons Joe described, that we've got a political electoral system, which all the features which Joe related, no gerrymandering, preferential voting, compulsory voting, we've had for 100 years. So there's literally nobody alive today can take credit for it. It's amazing. But someone would try to, no doubt. But the point is, I mean, what Murdoch is in the entertainment business, and he is, as Joe, great word of Joe's, I used it before. His media doesn't engage with its audience; it enrages its audience. That's what it's designed to do: rile people up. And that's their business model. And so you saw that the business model extends to lying. So we saw that. I mean, the reason they shelled out nearly $900 million US in damages in the Dominion voting machine case was because it was demonstrated that they had continued to propagate the lie that the 2020 election had been stolen when they knew it was a lie, because they believed their audience wanted to be lied to. And they're the most consequential lie, I would say, told in American politics in modern times. I mean, it created the context in which you had an attempted coup d'etat. I mean, we shouldn't mince words. I mean, this was not a group of innocent tourists who suddenly got a bit riled up. They stormed the Capitol. They were wanting to find the Vice President, not so they could reprimand him for his political views, but so they could hang him. I mean, we shouldn't, this has all been airbrushed out, partly by the media, because it's all too horrible to contemplate. And as far as the legal case in Nevada, well, I mean, if you say Trump's arrival and the events relating to him demonstrate that, Adam Sorkin and the other writers of West Wing lacked imagination, you'd have to say that this court case demonstrates that the writers of Succession lack sufficient imagination too. I mean, Rupert's, family trust basically leaves his 4 children by his first wife and his second wife, but not the 2 youngest ones. The 4 children, so the 2 women, Prudence and Elizabeth, and the sons, Lachlan and James, have basically got an equal say. And Rupert's trying to get that trust altered, this unalterable trust, so that Lachlan can be assured of being solely in charge. And his argument for doing so, it says only Lachlan can be relied upon to keep Fox News in particular as hard right conservative, as Rupert says it should be, and his argument, I think it is so specious, but who knows? I mean, as I said, they've got the former Attorney General making it for them. His argument is that that's in the best interests of the other children because that is how they make the most money. So in other words, the proposition is that, you know, I mean, lawyers will say anything for money, I suppose, but the proposition is they've got to stand up and say for a straight face, Your Honour, it is in the interests of my opponents that my client, Lachlan, has sole control of this and is able to freely pander to prejudice, anger and resentment and to freely tell lies because that's what the audience wants. And so we need the court to ensure that under some bizarre sense of responsibility or idealism, these other children of Mr. Murdoch's don't try to influence these media outlets to tell the truth or present what could be termed reality-based news. And that is the argument that's being presented in Nevada. And so it just reminds you of the wisdom of Mark Twain when he said, only fiction has to be credible.
Joe, we've spoken quite a bit about the implications of the election domestically in terms of media and for Australia, but of course there are global implications for everybody else. And one of the few areas, it seems, of bipartisan consensus now in the United States is around China and the American approach to China. So Biden has pursued some quite protectionist policies when it comes to China, and we know that Trump and JD Vance in particular have quite belligerent views of China as, particularly JD Vance, China as existential threat that must be countered. And some of the architecture behind that campaign even calls for complete economic decoupling with China. So has some fairly radical implications for the rest of the world, alongside the potential dismantling of the global financial system.
Minor things.
Is the age of free trade over, and what might that mean for the rest of the world?
Well, I think the age of free trade is over. More broadly, neoliberalism, as it was known, it had a 40-year reign. Bad idea, lasted a long time, but I think it is over, and it's been killed in some ways bipartisan. In a way, the U.S. Taking the role, bipartisan again, of not appointing judges to the WTO meant that disputes can't be resolved. And the argument that the U.S. Basically has is this court that we put in to resolve disputes has found us guilty, and therefore it's illegitimate. And so we have to end the court and get a court that always rules in favor of us. And the other countries in the world are not so sure that they agree that this is the right way of running a court system. So there is a fundamental problem, I think, at the WTO. From the point of view of a lot of developing countries, emerging markets, the U.S. position, I think, for good reason, of having industrial policies that for 40 years the U.S. criticized other countries for having industrial policies. All of a sudden, we're spending, the IRA is now estimated to be over $1 trillion. And I don't know if you guys know that that's a lot of money, even in Australia, I think. And the Chips and Science Act is another $250 billion. So U.S. has massive industrial policies, and other countries, even Europe, is saying we can't match those subsidies, and we say, well, that's your problem. So the whole architecture of trade has really been upended, and it is bipartisan, and it's not going to be easy to put together again. But let me say that there is a very big difference between Trump and the Democrats on attitudes towards China and attitudes towards globalization more generally. I think the Democrats understand that you need global cooperation to address global issues like climate change and pandemics. We don't. The Democrats know that climate change is a global issue. That's a reality. Pandemics. We've had one pandemic. Everybody believes that we'll have another one. And we will need cooperation. And so the Democrats are trying to dance a very difficult line here, where they are being quite honest, very harsh with China, but want China to cooperate on issues like pandemics and climate change. And whether that will work out is hard to see, but they say we're only going to impose a 10% tariff on China, and Trump says he's going to impose a 50% tariff. And part of the balancing that the Democrats are doing is not only how it will affect global cooperation, but also what it will do to the economy, to inflation. And 50% is viewed to be, that's a shock to the system. 10% our system can adapt to. So while they're both taking strong stances on China, and not for anything that China has done so far, but because they worry that China will do something. And China, President Xi said he's going to take over Taiwan, and we think that's not a good thing. So he's announced that he's going to do something. So there's a legitimate reason for us to be concerned and I think, to engage in de-risking. The intensity in both parties, but especially in the Republicans, is hard to justify.
It is. Malcolm, speaking of de-risking and a lot of money, does all of this, particularly Joe's comments about China, does all of this mean that the Australian government should still be pursuing the AUKUS submarine pact?
Well, that's I think the pillar one of AUKUS, which is really what is the main thing, which is about the submarines, I think was a catastrophic decision that Morrison made, and I think it was a terrible shame that Albanese and the Labor Party went along with it. And look, I'll just explain my reasoning for that. And this has got nothing to do with, my critique has got nothing to do with China. The proposition was, that Morrison's proposition was, which Albanese's adopted, was to acquire submarines which had nuclear propulsion. And, the argument for that is they can stay underwater for longer, and they can basically stay underwater pretty much forever as long as the crew's got enough to, baked beans to eat or whatever. But so it's really, their endurance is limited by the endurance of the crew, not the, they don't need to come to the surface to recharge their batteries, etc. I guess everyone understands that. But the fundamental problem with this is that this represents a complete abandonment of Australian sovereignty. Now, I was Prime Minister of Australia, and I don't think, when I was PM, when Abbott was PM, as far as I know, when Rudd and Gillard were PM, Howard was PM, Australian sovereignty was really important. But it doesn't seem to be important in the way it used to be. You see, basically, the reason we did not opt for naval nuclear propulsion in the partnership we had with France, which we were completely in control of. We were going to build the submarines in Australia. We had all the technology had been transferred, etc. It had been a thorough, bureaucratic process assessing, which contender to go for. The reason we hadn't gone for naval nuclear propulsion was because we don't have a nuclear industry in Australia. And it would take us many years to be able to manage naval nuclear propulsion ourselves. So we could have evolved to that in partnership with France, because France's submarines are, in fact, do use nuclear reactors to propel them. But interestingly, they do not use weapons-grade uranium in them. They use what's called low-enriched uranium, which is enriched to the same level as that you'd find in a civilian power station. So in that sense, it's much more manageable. But the problem with the AUKUS Pillar 1 deal is that, as you know, we are supposed to be getting Virginia-class submarines in the early 2030s from the Americans, 3 up to 5, and then at some point in the 2040s, an as-yet undesigned nuclear-powered submarine will be built in partnership with Britain. But that's so far off. It is way, way, way off. I do not believe we will ever get any nuclear submarines from the Americans. And the reason for that has got nothing to do with Donald Trump. And this is why the deal is so bad, because we have no agency. We've got no leverage. Essentially, in the United States Navy, the most valuable strategic assets are their Virginia-class submarines, their attack submarines called SSNs. And they are valuable because of their lethality, but also their survivability. As you've observed from the experience of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea, surface vessels are more vulnerable than ever. So, what do we know about the Virginias? The American Navy is short between 17 and 20 short of what they believe they need. Their industry is producing half as many as they need. It is the most valuable and survivable asset. And the legislation relating to this deal, the American legislation says that before any submarine can be sold to Australia, the US President has to certify that their Navy doesn't need it. Competitive rivalry with China is increasing. So, what's Trump got on the tin? America first. And that's what, and, I'm sure, I'm not the only former politician here tonight. As Paul Keating once said, in the great race of life, always back self-interest because it's trying. And that applies, that applies in politics more than anywhere else. And so the reality is the Americans will not part with the Virginia-class submarines. They will, and they'll say nothing. They're saying, you Aussies, you took the risk, you saw the legislation, we can only give them to you if we don't need them. And so what we are going to end up doing is apparently continue sending billions of dollars to the Americans to support the submarine industrial base. We are. We are. We're sending billions of dollars over there to their industrial base. We're building a nuclear submarine base in Perth, out of which American submarines will rotate. I think there'll be lots of young Australian sailors who will serve on American submarines, but we will not have any subs. And that is a scenario that is being actively, you can read all about it in the Congressional Research Service's paper on AUKUS. It's sort of called a military partnership, and the proposition is that Australia has no submarines at all. The Americans look after us, and we spend money that we would have otherwise spent on submarines and something else. So this great submarine deal, in my judgment, is almost certainly going to result in us having no submarines. It's a terrible, terrible mistake, but it is. Everyone calls for bipartisanship in politics, but sometimes if people are bipartisan in their error, it's not a good thing.
Joe, I think this might have to be my final question. But here in Australia, there has been for a long time this bipartisan consensus that our relationship with the United States is necessary for our security. So the AUKUS submarine deal is part of that, it is absolutely necessary to protect Australia from threat. I and others would argue that actually more often than not, Australia's relationship with the United States makes us less safe. And I wonder, how do you think, particularly in the context of your book, how do you think countries like Australia can keep ourselves and others safe? Where does security really come from?
Well, I guess I'd say there is conflict in the world, and we thought there would never be a land war in Europe, and Russia invaded Ukraine. China has not been aggressive very aggressive outside its boundaries, but it has announced, as I said before, that it's going to take over Taiwan. I don't think it probably is going to reach down to Australia, but one never knows how, over the long run, how these things evolve. But I do think there is a fundamental conflict between democracies, broadly understood and fragile as they may be, and these authoritarian regimes. And so I think there is a need for collective security. And, I was somewhat skeptical about the expansion of NATO in Europe, whether it was threatening to Russia and whether that would provoke Russia. After seeing what Russia did, I'm very convinced that they would have done that whether we had encircled them or not, and that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are really glad they joined, and Poland, and we are too, that they're really that NATO expanded. And I think that why should, you might say, that kind of alliance be limited to the Atlantic? It's really now a global issue. So I do think that we need global security arrangements. Again, I in the past I was very critical of U.S. spending on military. And I still am critical of the way we spend it. I've said we were spending money on weapons that didn't work against enemies that didn't exist. And we were spending a lot of money on weapons that didn't work. But now I realize that there are enemies that do exist, and that we unfortunately do need to have military spending, and there is a real need for global cooperation on security. But it is also the case that, especially with Trump, as Malcolm said, he doesn't believe agreements have any, a contract is just a piece of paper that you sign, and hopefully you dupe the other guy, and you know, it's part. He expects you to break the contract, and so he doesn't feel guilty when he breaks it because he believed that you knew that he was going to break it. So that means that you live in a world actually without contracts. And globally, one of the big differences between domestic life and international life, there's no real enforcement of contracts internationally. No. And that reality is something one really has to understand. And it means that to some extent, it's always going to be, enforcement is going to be limited to self-interest. But when you have good leaders, it's self-interested broadly understood to mean that you're going to be going on in a long-term relationship. And the nature of Trump is that he doesn't understand that broad. He's transactional. It's only for the moment. And it's no long, you know, there's no long-term. So I think if, God forbid, Trump got elected, you have to deal with that reality of that kind of world. But over the long term, hopefully America will have leaders that understand the nature of what I've just described, and Australia and the rest of the free world can develop relationships that are based on that kind of global cooperation. And let me just say one more thing, which is we've been fighting this kind of new Cold War without paying any attention to most of the third world, to the emerging markets or developing countries, and actually undertaking policies that are really adverse to them, and actually, you know, couldn't be worse policies for losing that war. So, for instance, during the pandemic, we had policies that led to vaccine apartheid. We used the WTO. It was dysfunctional, except for one thing: the role that the WTO played in denying access to vaccines to poor countries. And so that is the great achievement of our international trade architecture. So I think, and you know, I could give you other examples that right now there's a big discussion going on about reforming the multinational tax system. And the OECD has made a proposal that, in effect, reinforces the fact that the digital giants will not be taxed, and deprives the countries where production is occurring from getting the revenue that they ought to be getting. And the developing countries have said we ought to move the discussion out of the OECD, where it's been captured by big corporations, and move it into the UN. May not succeed there, but we know it's failed at the OECD. 2/3 of the countries of the world said, yes, we should move the discussion to the UN. It's going to happen. But the U.S. used all of its muscle to twist the arms of other countries to oppose this. So, you know, we lost. We used a lot of capital in losing, and we're not winning the Cold War. So I find it just unbelievable, and this is under a Democratic administration. So you can imagine how bad it's going to be under a Republican administration. So what I think is, to go back to your question, I do think there needs to be global cooperation, but I think we have to view this question from a global perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, I think we might be out of time. We could keep going for hours, I know. But I will hand over to Richard now. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. You beat me to it. I was going to ask you to give them a round of applause, which I will in a minute. But, wow, what a night. Thank you all. I mean, at the Australia Institute, we've been having a bit of planning in the lead up to the election, and Emma and myself and a few others been coming up with some kind of key themes that we want to focus on and really what's really important. And the number one thing that came out of our discussions in terms of how we keep our feet on the ground and what we're aiming for was that Australia matters. And then the second one is that government policy matters. And I just think, hearing Malcolm tonight talking about the need for the Australian government, the Australian ambassador, whoever it is, to stand up for Australians, I think it's terrifying that we as a nation might ever think that we don't have agency in the world. We don't have control, but we absolutely have agency. And Australia's GDP is about the size of a little European country called Russia. But we're not quite as optimistic in our foreign policy.
Thank God for that.
No, and in part this is because of our sense of self. And of course, we need to have powerful allies. We need strong allies, strong relationships. But the idea that we can't kind of sail the choppy seas without someone else is not something that bothers Putin at night, it seems. So I'm not in any way pushing for an expansionist Australia. But no, it's important that we understand that we're not a little country. We've got a continent. We're the 13th largest economy in the world. We're the largest... Our share of the iron ore market is bigger than OPEC's share of oil. You didn't know that. Half of the gas we sell overseas, we paid no royalty, we gave away for free. Right? We are big. We have agency. And conversations like tonight hopefully challenge us to think about how we use that. Not to control things, but to influence things, to shape things, including shape our relationship with our close allies like the US. And if we can export some of our electoral architecture to the US rather than export Rupert Murdoch, I think the US would be in much greater shape. So again, thank you all for coming tonight. Please join me in thanking our guests. One oversight I forgot to mention, and my friend Melanie is here, she'll chide me, that Joe was also, in introducing him I didn't mention, was the winner of the Sydney Peace Prize. So well done, Joe. And Joe's books are for sale out there tonight if you'd like to get his latest book. It is an absolutely banging read, but he's not doing signings tonight. We've had him working since 8 o'clock this morning. He's speaking at University of Technology tomorrow night. We're taking him around Australia. He's got a long trip in front of him. But the books are for sale outside if you'd like to get one, but you won't get a signature tonight. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.